Well, thank you to the choir. That was very lovely. It's good to be back in worship with you today, now that the Christmas festivities are winding down. For the next several months, we're going to spend some time studying the Gospel of Mark. This is something that I haven't really done before, staying in one gospel for an entirety of a season, but it's going to lead us up to Lent and to Easter, and I think it's going to be good for us. So we'll go ahead and begin this morning with the first chapter of Mark, verses 21 through 28. There we go. Okay. And Mark says, "They went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, he, Jesus, entered the synagogue and taught. They were astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority." We're going to come back and look at that word authority, "and not as the scribes. Just then there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, 'What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are. I know who you are, the Holy One of God.' But Jesus rebuked him, saying, 'Be silent and come out of him.' And the unclean spirit, convulsing him and crying with a loud voice, came out of him. Now they were all amazed, and they kept on asking one another, 'What is this?'" Here comes that word again. "A new teaching with authority. He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." All at once his fame, Jesus, began to spread throughout the surrounding region of Galilee. So what we're going to see over the next several months is that in the Gospel of Mark, there are not a whole lot of details about anything. Mark gets right to the point. There's no embellishment or poetry or anything else. Mark says, this is what you need to know, this is what you need to decide, this is what you need to do to move forth. And in this opening chapter of the Gospel of Mark, this is where Jesus begins his preaching. And did you note in the reading how he does this? So they're gathered together for worship in the synagogue. That would have been a Jewish community, kind of like a house church. Maybe they were in some sort of worship place that's set aside other than a house. All of a sudden, a stranger, remember, nobody knows who he is yet, really. A stranger comes into the house and says, "Excuse me, do you mind if I tell you something about God?" Now imagine this right now. So we're sitting here, we're worshiping, it's a new year, 2020. Matt's standing back there. All of a sudden the doors fly open and someone comes running down the center aisle and says, "Excuse me, do you mind if I stand in the pulpit this morning and share with you a word about God?" What do you think we do? Duck for cover and call the police, right? But Jesus does this. Jesus enters into a synagogue where no one knows who he is and says, "I have something new to tell you about God." And then Jesus begins to teach. And if you look at that scripture reading for today, it says that he teaches, but not like the scribes. So what Mark is saying is that generally when teaching from the scriptures, the Old Testament, the scriptures for the Jewish people, the scribes would be able to say, well, this is what the text says, and these are some traditional ways of understanding it. But Jesus comes in and says, this is what the scripture says, this is what God is, this is what I say to you. And now you have to decide if this new way of understanding can be meaningful to you. In other words, Jesus is bringing a new way, a new vision of placing authority in God and the Scriptures. And those gathered in the synagogue were amazed at what he had to say. Now, keeping with his style, Mark doesn't give any details about what it is that Jesus said that made them so amazed, but something captured their attention. Now, I read a book over Christmas break called Black River. And it's a modern-day Western that's dominated by acts of violence. And the main character in there, his name is Wes. He's 66 years old. In the opening pages, his wife just passes away from leukemia, but his grief is distracted because he's received a letter. And in this letter, it's an invitation, if he wants, to come and speak at a parole hearing. Now, the background of the story is this. For years, Wes was a CO, a correctional officer at a prison. And at one point, when he was on shift, there was a riot in the prison. And Wes was captured and was held ransom. And this prisoner named Williams, was really mean to Wes, including, and this is the set of the novel, breaking each of his fingers. Now, this is an important detail because Wes, even though he worked as a correctional officer to pay the bills, was really a famous fiddler. He would travel around the nation playing in all of these little musical festivals and gatherings. But after that, he could no longer ever play the fiddle again. And the fiddle was what brought him closest to God. So 20 years have passed, and Wes goes back to bury his wife's ashes, the same town where the prison is still. And he has to decide, should I go to this parole hearing? Well, he decides to go. And he enters into this parole hearing. And there's 3 people sitting there, and then they lead Williams in, and Williams is shackled and handcuffed. And Williams has a chance to talk first. And he talks about how in prison his life had been transformed by God. And he says since that day in the riot, he has a new way of believing and a new way of seeing. And he would like to be paroled in order to be free. So now, Wes, the correctional officer who had his fingers broken, he has to decide if he can believe what Williams is saying. Can he believe that Williams does really have a new way of living and of being? So Wes offers his testimony. He goes back. He's convinced the parole board will deny parole, but they don't. They give Williams parole. So Wes decides that he's going to have to take things into his own hands. And so he goes on the day that Williams is to be released, and he meets him at a bus station. And he has in his pocket a gun. And this conversation ensues, and it's clear to Williams what's going to happen here with Wes. And Williams says, remember that day of the riot when I told you to pray? And Wes says, yeah, I remember that day. You made me pray. And Williams says, that was the day that my life was changed. And Wes says, that was a prayer that you made me pray. And Williams says, it's because you prayed that prayer. It was the most authentic thing I've ever heard. It changed me. And so Wes has to decide right then and there whether or not he's going to take matters into his own hand. Now, I'll leave it there because I don't want to ruin the book if you decide to read it. But let me ask you this. When someone tells you that they have a new way of being, a new way of seeing, that they've taken a new path, that they've changed their life, that they're starting over, that it's a 2020 vision, that they're all ready for the new year, will you believe them? And then when you hear the stories about an itinerant preacher who comes from the son of a carpenter, who is a nobody from nowhere, who comes into a village and breaks into the synagogue and begins to preach with a word that brings authority, say the scriptures, will you believe him? In the story from the gospel this morning, the only one who can recognize who Jesus is the one who was possessed by the quote, unclean spirit. Now, you can interpret that word however you want. You could say devil, darkness, demon, depression, whatever it is. But that darkness realizes the power of the brightness of God, and it is scared. There is a lot of darkness right now, right? There are threats of war. There are children saying, what does this mean? There are questions about our future as communities, as a world, all of this that comes together. But within that darkness, and this is the whole reason for the day of Epiphany, there is also a light that shines bright. And so the question this morning on this Epiphany Sunday of 2020 is, can you and will you let that light shine bright for you? In our Sunday school class this morning, we spent just a few minutes watching a video clip by Brene Brown. And she talks about how God sends Jesus in order to show us what perfect love is all about. She says that if we were to choose how to describe love by ourselves, we would choose unicorns and candy sweethearts or something like that. But real love goes to the places where the darkness doesn't shine. Real love casts out the demons. Real love does what is hardest. And real love, unlike humans, always does what is right, not what is easy. So as you move into this new year, may you follow that love. May you choose the choice of doing what is right, not what is easy. And may you do so because you believe in the authority of one who came into a synagogue and said, this is a new way of living, a new way of being, a new way of doing. Through Christ, we say together, Amen.